It's always a pleasure being here. It's like part of my professional life. I was working here in Yemet long ago already. My name is Javier Albarracín. As I said, I've been working for the Mediterranean around 25 years. And I would like to introduce you Alícia Pérez-Porro. Alícia Pérez-Porro has a long experience on the topic that we are going to be seeing today, which is science diplomacy. She's scientific by default, I would say, by career, inevitably for her, but she has also moved in last years into diplomacy, into international relations and diplomacy. She has been, we were talking before, about 15 years in the United States.
Yeah, it was like 12 years in the US.
12 years in the US, working in different places, always related to science, but also, as I said, doing the journey towards science diplomacy. She's going to be explaining the concept of science diplomacy today with plenty of insights, but she, as I said before, she is the coordinator, scientific coordinator of one of the main research centers in ecology, biodiversity, and everything around this concept of ecology, from water to prevention of desertification, fighting against wild forests in the Mediterranean, is one of the references, which is called CREAF. It's based in the Autonomous University of Barcelona, but is very well known and reputed not only in Spain, but also in Europe. And together, with my background, but also with the huge experience and knowledge of CREAF, we are developing precisely the Mediterranean strategy of science diplomacy approach of CREAF towards the Mediterranean. We are working to promote all this knowledge that CREAF has, with more than 250 researchers in different topics, as I was mentioning before, but we are promoting landing all this high-level knowledge into the different stakeholders in the Mediterranean. So trying to reach agreements with similar research centers, trying to impact what is called science to policy, bringing to decision makers all the knowledge and trying to inspire, give some insights of scientific knowledge while taking decisions in the Mediterranean. So we're working in that strategy for around 1.5 years, and it's going to take some more years, and we are talking with different, all type of, I would say, transversal, but also vertical types of stakeholders. So in that sense, she not only has a very powerful scientific and international relations strategy, background and knowledge, but she is involved in different concrete science diplomacy strategies. So in that sense, Alícia, floor is yours.
Thank you, Javier. Well, thank you for the introduction. Thank you all for coming. I know it's late. And thank you to Yemet and Blanquerna for inviting me and giving me the chance to talk about something that I do care a lot about it, and also I think that is really, really interesting, which is science diplomacy. So how does this work? Does it work like this? No, okay, yeah, okay. We are also including non-traditional actors into diplomacy, in this case, scientists. And why? Why is that? Well, mainly this is because of global challenges. And these global challenges require a new era of international cooperation, right? Like you can identify here like climate change, biodiversity loss, water scarcity and management, agriculture, you name it. There are a lot of global challenges nowadays. So, and with globalization, there is an intensification of cross-boundary interactions. We have climate change, for instance, that is creating new collective action problems for foreign policy, like migration, food insecurity, economic instability, pandemics. And all of that requires new specialties. So health diplomacy, nuclear diplomacy, disaster diplomacy, and of course, science diplomacy. So, and to confront all of these new global challenges, or not that new, we also need a lot of different actors, not only the traditional actors, and innovating innovative processes. So let's talk again about what is exactly science diplomacy. And I think that the takeaway message for you today is that it is not new. It is not a new term. It is true that the term began to appear in publications around 2005, but scientific cooperation across borders, documented, goes back to the 17th century. In fact, in 1723, the British Royal Society created the position of Foreign Secretary of the Royal Society to maintain regular correspondence with scientists overseas to ensure that the Society's fellows remain up to date with the latest ideas and research findings. We also have activities and policies pursued by state actors that go back to the 19th century. In 1898, the USA, the United States of America, stationed a science attaché that was a zoologist, was Charles Warden Stiles, in its Berlin embassy. And since then, science attachés have been part of the diplomatic body of the US, and especially during the 50s and the 60s. And that trend increased after World War II to work towards peaceful relations, especially focusing on concerns on nuclear weapons and nuclear energy. So it is not new, but the term per se appeared at the beginning of the 2000s. So science diplomacy has 3 dimensions. And the 3 dimensions are diplomacy for science, science for diplomacy, and science in diplomacy. If we go with science for diplomacy, it is basically using science cooperation to improve international relations between countries by supporting collaborations and seeking international partnerships. An example of that is Sesame. Sesame is a synchrotron lab. They have this idea that nature knows no political borders, which is true. So, and they build their whole curricula based on that. Another dimension of science diplomacy is the diplomacy for science. What is diplomacy for science? Well, it's facilitating international science cooperation. That often includes large-scale research facilities, which, given their cost and resource intensity, can only be built through collaboration among a number of countries. A good example of that is CERN. Do you know CERN? Does anyone know CERN? Okay, so CERN is the European Organization for Nuclear Research. Was founded in 1954, and it was after negotiations between 12 different countries, including Western Germany. So 1954, Western Germany, which it was the first time that the country had been included in an international organization after World War II. Not only that, if you visit CERN at some point, which you should because it's impressive, the synchrotron that they have, which is under Earth, I don't know how to say that. Yeah. So it crossed 3 different borders of 3 different countries. So that's also diplomacy for science. And then we have the last dimension of science diplomacy, which is science in diplomacy, which is basically informing foreign policy objectives with scientific advice. So foreign policy decision-making and international negotiations need to build on sound scientific advice and be grounded on the latest research. So 3 examples of that are, and probably at least you should know one of them, which is the IPCC, because it's on the news constantly, but let's go through all of them. So the IPCC is the Intergovernmental Panel of Experts on Climate Change. It is a group of scientists from all over the world. They're experts on climate change, and every couple of years they produce a report, a scientific report, with the latest research possible on climate change issues. Afterwards, this report is being used at the negotiations around climate change led by the UNFCCC. The UNFCCC is the body, the Framework Conference for Climate Change, the UN, United Nations body that basically is in charge of the governance of climate change internationally. So those negotiations are based on the science of the IPCC, not exclusively, because science shouldn't be the only topic informing the negotiations, but it is one of them. Then we have IPBES, which is probably not that well known for most of you, but it is kind of like the same of IPCC, but for biodiversity. It is the Science and Policy for People and Nature. It is also an intergovernmental panel of experts, scientists from all over the world, but their expertise is on biodiversity. And they also produce these scientific reports about biodiversity that they are being used in the negotiations of the CBD, which is the UN body that regulates biodiversity, is the Convention for Biological Diversity. Probably recently in the news, you read about COP27, right? It was in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. And then maybe, hopefully, you heard something about COP15 in Montreal. So COP15 is organized by the CBD, and the COP27 was organized by the UNFCCC, and these two bodies, IPBES and IPCC, are the ones informing those negotiations. But we also have an example here in the Mediterranean, which is MEDEC. MEDEC is also a panel of Mediterranean experts on climate and environmental change. And it's the same thing. It's a group of experts from all the Mediterranean countries that produce a scientific report with the latest research possible around climate change in the Mediterranean region. So these are three examples of science in diplomacy. And these are the three dimensions that we have when we talk about science diplomacy. So again, what is science diplomacy? Well, there is no one single agreed upon definition. What it is important to remember is that science diplomacy is an umbrella term that combines many different facets and practices at the intersection of international relations and science policy. It is also a term used to advocate for a particular perspective. For example, it is used by scientists to champion science and the scientific method. You don't like, am I going to give them the presentation afterwards? Maybe? Oh, okay. So these are different definitions for science diplomacy. So that's why I'm saying that you have this umbrella term. And I think that it's also important to remember that this diversity in definitions should be welcomed. At the same time, it's also a boundary problem, because science diplomacy is about bringing actors together that belong to different social worlds. So the traditional diplomat and the traditional scientist, for example. And this boundary problem perspective means that not one particular worldview is privileged. So what we have here is that if you think about the green part, is the international politico-scientific context, right? And here you have global interdependencies, you have inequalities, crises, competing value systems, and embedded in this international politico-scientific context, you have these three big yellow bubbles, right? Scientific knowledge production, problem deliberation and reflection, and politics and powering. And in the middle, the blue zone, is the science diplomacy interaction space, where the magic happens. So who is practicing science diplomacy, and why? Why are they interested in practicing science diplomacy? Well, you have states and their representatives, and the why is, first of all, access to researchers, research findings, and research facilities, natural resources. Then you have promotion, to promote the country's research and development achievements. You also have influence, right? Impact public opinions abroad and the opinion of foreign decision makers. And you also have research cooperation, support participation in large-scale research efforts that would otherwise not be realistic or possible, like we mentioned CERN. And lastly, you also have addressing global challenges, like we were mentioning before, climate change, for instance, or biodiversity loss. And who inside states and the representatives are part of science diplomacy? Well, you have scientists serving as science attachés. Spain used to have 3 science attachés, one in the embassy in Washington, D.C., another one in Berlin, and another one in the UK. Unfortunately, not anymore, but a lot of other countries have science attachés. France has science attachés. I mentioned the US. Then you have officials from other ministries and national institutions. You also have diplomats, career diplomats with a portfolio that includes science and technology. For instance, now that Spain doesn't have science attachés anymore, the representative in the embassy in DC in charge of culture is in charge of culture and science. So science is part of his portfolio. You have networks abroad. I was part of ECUSA, which is the network for Spanish scientists in the US, for instance, and we were collaborating with the embassy constantly. We were actors in the science diplomacy sphere. And then you have complex domestic networks. But you also have non-state actors, right? Like international organizations, that could be UNESCO or the World Academy of Sciences, TRUST, and also scientific academies and individual scientists that are interested in the topic and they want to know more, they want to get involved. And scientific academies could be like Geophysical Academy, for instance. This can be like actually very powerful. And before IPCC, before IPBES, before all of those intergovernmental platforms, they were the main sources for scientific information informing international processes. And how does all of this work, right? So you have, on one side, you have scientific advice, scientific publications, you also have advisory groups, you have projects, and all of this informs international diplomacy. And here is the traditional perspective of diplomacy, right? You inform international diplomacy that is facilitating, and it's like producing the agreements, negotiations, and then you have science cooperation. And science cooperation can be like funding programs or cooperation agreements, and all of this basically improves the whole system. And all of these things are happening at the same time. If only one thing is happening, the whole thing doesn't work. So everything needs to be on the move constantly. So what's the importance when we think about science diplomacy in the Mediterranean region? Why do we need to talk about this, basically, right? So the Euro-Mediterranean region is a crossroads of civilizations where cultures and science have been intertwined for millennia. So throughout history, science has served as a meeting point to build alliances between countries beyond political circumstances in support of diplomatic agreements in areas of like the things that we were mentioning: global health, biodiversity conservation, ocean governance, among many, many others. So let's focus for a second in one of these things: climate change. So in case you were not aware of this, the Mediterranean region is one of the main hotspots for climate change on Earth. Why? Well, basically because on average, the Mediterranean region is warming up 20% faster than the rest of the world. Plus, 70% of the population lives in urban areas, which is a complication. So that makes the Mediterranean area susceptible for extreme weather events, food insecurity, water scarcity, biodiversity loss, all the usual suspects. So these problems need to be tackled through regional long-term cooperation in research, innovation, and capacity building. But, well, international research collaboration is essential to understanding these shared challenges, and providing common ground is not enough, is not sufficient. So robust diplomatic frameworks must be also in place to overcome obstacles to cross-border cooperation caused by political, geographical, social, or conflict-related challenges. And this will require stronger alignment on the scientific and diplomatic agendas at both the national and regional levels, as well as innovative instruments, partnerships, and coalitions among a broader range of actors to ultimately place science, health, climate, and the environment at the heart of the regional agenda. So basically, if climate change is not addressed, right, then it's going to escalate, and this escalation is going to affect society, the environment, the economy. So the good news is that science diplomacy has the potential to leverage scientific cooperation on shared environment and health problems to bridge the divides between the southeast and the north shores. At the same time, it can help to reduce disparities between subregions on issues where wide gaps persist, such as in education, social inequalities, technology, access to safe water, and gender equality. So this makes the Mediterranean region an optimal testbed for all those transformative initiatives. It is also important to highlight that scientific and cultural diplomacy are two sides of the same coin that must go hand in hand, given the shared Mediterranean values and identity. So science diplomacy can be a powerful tool for understanding and achieving regional objectives while fostering a positive sense of belonging to a cross-border community based on skill, openness, and win-win solutions. So I mentioned before that science cooperation, all of these things are very important, research, innovation, but that we also need the diplomatic and political framework, because if we don't have these two things, it's not going to work, right? So in the Mediterranean, we have some of this diplomatic and political framework. And I'm just going to mention a little bit of it, which is, so for instance, we have the Barcelona Declaration that was signed in '95, and already recognized the importance of science, diplomacy, and the role of science and technology in the socioeconomic development of the Mediterranean. We also have that in 2015, science diplomacy was elevated in the European Union as an external dimension of the EU's science and innovation policy. We also have in 2017 the Valletta Declaration, and knowledge was identified as an engine for sustainable development and job growth. And we have a new agenda for the Mediterranean. And in this new agenda, research and innovation are key ingredients for the achievements of a more resilient and inclusive growth. So that's good news. We have the diplomatic and political framework to make science diplomacy operative. So I'm going to give you some examples of institutions, initiatives that are already in place here in the Mediterranean, and that they were in place because we have the research and because we have these diplomatic frameworks that I was mentioning. So if we think about sustainable food systems, the Mediterranean is a region with high population growth. I already mentioned that it's a hotspot for climate change, so increasing environmental and climate risks. Used to be an export region for agriculture, but now we are importing 20 to 50% of its food. Then we have problems with water scarcity, agrobiodiversity loss. So these are all challenges for food security and nutrition. So let's go to the good news now, which is the Mediterranean diet, right? So the Mediterranean diet holds the potential to act as a powerful lever for bridging food consumption and production in a sustainable way. So we have these coordinated efforts across a range of actors, institutions, and sectors, and we also have to address trade-offs between competing economic, environmental, and societal objectives. How are we going to do that, or how are we doing this? We have this example, the SFS Med Sustainable Food Systems Platform. And it's a regional framework to leverage existing knowledge, experience, and skills of institutions across the Mediterranean to develop and adopt an innovative and science-based framework to support the transformation towards a more sustainable food system. So it's a robust science policy interface and facilitates science diplomacy. And actors in this platform are the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO. We also have CREAF, which is the International Center for Advanced Mediterranean Agronomic Studies, and the Union for the Mediterranean, the UFM. And I'm going to just give you a little bit more information about CREAF, because I do think that is a very interesting organization. It's an intergovernmental organization comprised by 13 ministers of agriculture from 13 different Mediterranean countries. And CREAF embodies and implements science diplomacy since its inception in the 60s. So it's promoting scientific understanding in the Mediterranean by training generations of scientists and policymakers at the same time. Let's change topics now, and let's talk about climate change. I already mentioned MEDEC, right? That kind of like Mediterranean IPCC platform. But we also have the 2030 Greener Med Agenda. I'm going to just go a little bit fast because I think that we are not going to have enough time. So we also have the Greener Med Agenda, political and operational convergence to accelerate the transition of the Mediterranean regions towards a more green, circular, and inclusive economy. We have the MAP, the Mediterranean Action Plan, which was adopted in 1975, and it was developed with the United Nations Environmental Programme, UNEP, and it's an institutional framework for cooperation in addressing common challenges of marine environmental degradation. So that's why it's here, because I'm a marine biologist. And then we have the MSSD, which is the Mediterranean Strategy for Sustainable Development, which it's a strategic guiding document for all stakeholders and partners to basically translate the 2030 agenda for sustainable development at the regional, sub-regional, and national level. And I wanna highlight this objective number 4, addressing climate change as a priority issue for the Mediterranean, because in that objective, they say the establishment of a regional science policy interface mechanism with a view to preparing consolidated regional scientific assessment and guidance on climate change trends, impacts, and adaptation and mitigation options. So science is a key part of this guiding document. Then if we talk about marine biodiversity and blue economy, we have research coordination actions like BlueMed, which basically aims to achieve critical mass in research funding by connecting national initiatives in a single research and innovation agenda. Then we also have MEDBESP, the Mediterranean Blue Economy Stakeholder Platform. Is a regional networking platform. They share knowledge. And then we have, under the UNEP MAP, the MAP Convention, the MAP Barcelona Convention system. And it's a legally binding set of policies, instruments, and action plans for addressing common issues and challenges of environmental degradation and protecting marine and coastal ecosystems of the Mediterranean Sea. I also wanted to give you a little bit of the importance of higher education, mobility, and the academic networks in science diplomacy. So the UFM produced this report. It was a study that analyzed the internationalization trends and patterns of 10 southern and eastern Mediterranean countries, where Algeria, Egypt, Israel, Jordan, Lebanon, Libya, Mauritania, Morocco, Palestine, and Tunisia. And basically, they identified that the obstacles and challenges for internationalization and they made a series of recommendations to overcome them and foster regional integration. So several recommendations were designed to address national and regional challenges, the most salient being the need to support scientific collaboration with the aim to easing political tensions, the thing that we were saying, right, about like science for diplomacy, and upscaling bilateral cooperation towards the thematic regional approach, like shared challenges, and supporting long-term stability, ultimately reducing the country's isolation through the improvement of the attractiveness of local higher education systems. Because we usually think about internationalization and mobility, and we think about like importing scientists, right? But we also, exporting scientists and talent. It is important to import scientists and talent, but most importantly, we need to retain them. It is a key part. So an internationalization and of higher education, mobility, and academic networks are a key part of science diplomacy. So just to name a few of the actors working on that, we have EMUNI, the Euro-Mediterranean University, that was established in 2008 in Slovenia. It's a network of more than 130 universities. We also have the Mediterranean Universities Union, UNIMED, that was founded in 1991. It's an association of universities from countries of the Mediterranean basin. And then we have CREAF, because in CREAF we also have a mobility program that we are promoting around the Mediterranean region. So what are the challenges and barriers to science diplomacy in the Mediterranean region? Well, we identified 8 challenges and barriers. So we have a fragmented landscape, right? Because you have, how many actors I've been talking about? So we have a lot of actors, a lot of initiatives in the region, and this leads to fragmentation. So we have fragmentation of efforts, and that means that the synergies are limited, and sometimes we have the risk of redundancy. We also have communities that don't talk to each other. So in most Mediterranean countries, the scientific and diplomatic communities, they are separated. They're in silos, both educationally and professionally. So you are in a Master's of International Relations, right? How many of you interacted in the last 6 months with a scientist or someone studying science? 2, 3, 4. Oh my God, really good. So this is very important, to interact with people studying different things. So, and it seems that it seems nothing, right? But it is not that usual. So then we have the lack of awareness and skills. So many of research and innovation initiatives in the Mediterranean are connected to science diplomacy in different fields and institutional configurations, but these rarely share the terminology, for instance. We have also asymmetric cooperation. The rules of international research cooperation across Mediterranean countries need to be more aligned. And South-South cooperation needs to be strengthened in order to foster a culture of cooperation. Then, number 5, disinformation and misinformation. I think that we all can think about COVID-19, and we can all think about what was happening in the world with misinformation and disinformation around the science of the global pandemic. We have also cooperation versus competition, because science diplomacy can be collaborative, and nations can cooperate to tackle shared challenges, right? But it's also competitive, because they need to defend and promote their national interests, and they also need to attract the best scientific talent. We also have the scientific excellence and political neutrality. So politicization of science and instrumentalization of scientists for political and diplomatic goals. We also had a little bit of that during the COVID-19 pandemic. And then we have gender policy or actions plans that are insufficient, because I've been not really mentioning gender equality, but the thing that grabs all together is gender equality. All the things that I've been explaining, you need to think about them from the lens of gender equality, because without gender equality, we are not going to tackle or achieve absolutely anything. So we need concrete tools to reach commitments with implementation strategies. So what are the recommendations? What are the recommendations and proposed actions? So we have training and awareness programs for both academic and diplomatic communities, both separately but also together, right? It could be fantastic if at some point all of you can get together to the same students in a different master related with scientific topics, and you share experiences and you share knowledge. That could be a starting point. Then we have promoting joint research projects between the North and the South on transboundary issues and common interest. And we have some successful models here. Bloomer, I already mentioned that, and Prima, which I didn't mention it, but if you're interested, I can talk about this later. We have science advisory mechanisms in foreign policy. So establishing science advisory mechanisms in foreign policy structures, like science attachés in embassies, science and technology advisors for foreign ministries, science diplomacy fellowships, exchange programs. Then a better integration between the scientific and the diplomatic spheres, so through both formal dialogues and informal bottom-up networks and intercultural engagement at national and regional level. And lastly, capacity building and technical assistance for gender mainstreaming. So in public administrations and in the academic and private sectors, based on evidence, correlations between gender equality and positive impact for all. So what are the conclusions? So to keep it simple, I'm going to mention two main conclusions. Number one is that science diplomacy is a powerful tool for understanding and achieving regional objectives while fostering a positive sense of belonging to a cross-border community based on skills, openness, and win-win solutions. And also, number two is that the Mediterranean has always been an area of brilliant minds and great ideas. Promoting science diplomacy as an essential tool to foster regional integration should be in every agenda. And with this, thank you very much, and I hope that you have a lot of questions.
Thank you very much, Alice. Plenty of insights. I've seen people taking notes, people taking pictures. I'm sure that you all know that you can find, it's been recorded, so tomorrow it will be already uploaded in, I think it's in the YouTube channel of EMET or through EMET webpage itself. So there you can follow, because there's been plenty of insights, plenty of topics, plenty of names and acronyms of many organizations and so on. No, because it's a dense and intense vertical and horizontal issue. And in fact, we are going to see in time, I mean, this same conference, eventually 5-10 years ago, would be as needed as today, but would be less relevant as it is today, because time, fortunately or unfortunately, is in favor of merging science and policy. It used to be something that was just a theoretical issue, but fortunately and unfortunately, reality, from COVID to climate emergency, other issues like we were mentioning before, agriculture and food issues, are really making it even more needed than ever, that they have a merge or a synergies between these two worlds. Sorry, not these two worlds. This complex world is the same one. Okay, so let me first pass the floor to the people that is with us. If there is any question, any doubt, any need of clarification, if not, I will point some of you to make some questions. Thank you very much. If you can introduce yourself before you do the question.
Thank you.
I'm going to ask you something there. Don't worry.
Well, my name is Federico Guerrero. I'm the coordinator of the Master in Advanced Studies of International Affairs of Blanquerna. So first of all, I would like to thank you both for this, Javier for chairing this conference, and Alícia for being so great, introducing us to something quite new, because I belong to the world of diplomacy, foreign policy, hard politics, if you want. And that's really interesting in order to introduce different elements into the debate. Basically, I would like to make two questions, okay? When you mentioned the three elements we can find in science diplomacy, you mentioned about science in diplomacy, if I'm not wrong, sorry about that. Informing foreign policy objectives with scientific advice, okay? But we know that here we have a problem of interest. So politicians, they basically try to respond to the national interest, okay? We know that these kind of problems are global problems, okay? Which is the level of resistance that you, from the scientific perspective, find with this kind of more classical, if you want, actors like governments, okay? Because as I said, they always move according to these interests that, as Javier said, we see that these kind of topics that some years ago were considered low politics, now they are in the top of the agenda, okay? That's one question. And the other is about gender, okay? We know that we have the problem of glass ceiling with gender, especially in politics. But science could be an area, although we know that we also have the problem with the level of the number, not the level, the number of women in science, leading projects, etc. In your experience with the Mediterranean, especially with the cultural factor regarding women, have you found, or you find some kind of space in which women in the Mediterranean, in these kind of networks you are working on, they are leading projects, well, you're an example, okay? But from the southern part. I mean, the idea not to replicate north and southern, okay? Mm-hmm. So we have these kind of networks, but this, you talk about the projects in Jordan, in Israel, but the idea is that, do you have this kind of experience of southern women leading these kind of projects? So that's a way to empower them and also to introduce some changes. Thank you.
Okay. So trying to answer your first question, I think that this is the hardest part of being a science diplomat, right? That is working in science and diplomacy. You're just informing, basically informing. And that's why I mentioned that we are not trying to replace traditional diplomats or traditional diplomacy, because traditional diplomats and traditional diplomacy is needed the way it is. And diplomats, career diplomats, are trained to defend and pursue the national interests, and that is and that's what it is. So when you are asked to inform in negotiations, for instance, you are not trying to make them change because they have an agenda, and usually they are receiving orders from someone else. So, and you cannot change that agenda. So it is very difficult. So I work in environmental science diplomacy, right? So I work to all of these COPs around the world. I don't inform the Spanish government because it works in a different way. But I've been working with other governments, and it is really frustrating when you know the science and you communicate the science, but they do something that goes against the science in the negotiation room, and you cannot say anything. I mean, it's what it is. They are maybe taking a different perspective. That's why I mentioned that it is important to remember that science is not the only field informing the negotiations, because you also have economics, you also have social perspectives, and all of these things need to be leveraged. Sometimes negotiators don't follow the science because they follow the economics. Sometimes they don't follow the economics because they follow the social. So it is difficult, it is frustrating, but I think that the positive side of all of this is that science is getting more and more of a voice in its own in these negotiations. And I also think that the general public is nowadays more informed than ever about the science. So, and these negotiators that are getting orders from someone above them go back to their countries once the negotiations are over, and then hopefully they live in democracy, and then the public, the general public, is going to have a perspective on how they did on the negotiations, and they will pay the price if they have to. So I think that informing negotiations, informing all of this process are equally important as giving the general public the scientific information. So if they don't listen to you on one side, they are going to listen to you on the other side. But it is difficult and it is frustrating. About the other one, about gender equality, we always say, women working in science diplomacy, we always say that we have two glass ceilings, because you have the women in STEM glass ceiling, and you have the women in diplomacy glass ceiling. Because if you think about diplomacy, how many women do you see in these places? You know, I go to all of these meetings, and there's a lot of black suits, and there are no women, or just very few. But you go to a research institution, and you are going to find a lot of women working in administration, a lot of women working in management, a lot of women working as technicians. But how many principal investigators, how many women directors of a research center, how many women, you know, at the top level of our university? I think that the numbers nowadays is that only 20% of universities in Europe have a woman leading them. So, hence the two glass ceilings. In the south of the Mediterranean region, it is difficult to find women leading projects, but women are instrumental, because what we want for these projects is to be translated into reality. And for this, women are instrumental. And if you don't have women in the projects, most likely those projects are not going to be a success. So definitely needs to be more women leading projects. But the cultural reality is that that's difficult. And it even sometimes, they don't want to talk to you because you're a woman. So, and you don't want to jeopardize the whole project. So you have to bring someone else. And it's the cultural reality of of some countries, not all of them, of some countries. Yep.
If I may add something, we're talking about the Mediterranean, and in fact, one of the weakest points in the south of the Mediterranean, and too often also in the north of the Mediterranean, is the quality of the institutions, okay, in a broad sense. So in that sense, they take decisions based on very narrow interests. Sometimes it's national security, sometimes it's where I was born, so I'm going to develop that region. Another time is based on, I don't know what type of other insights that make you take decisions that are absolutely out of any sort of influence of science and knowledge. Of course, it's not the same Morocco than it could be Algeria, but we are talking about a region in which the quality of the institutions basically is missing, is opaque. It's quite narrow in terms of national point of view, national interest in a broad sense. So if it's difficult that science can have an impact in decision making, in development projects, in water management, in agriculture, in the north, because sometimes I am a defender of the certain Mediterraneanness, because there is also certain ways of doing, I'm not going to say doing business, but living life or managing things in the north of the Mediterranean that resemble quite often to some patterns of behavior in the south. But in that sense, if it's difficult in the north to have an impact of science, imagine what type of decisions in Egypt, I'm saying a key country in the south, in Egypt, which massive challenges of water management, of food security, on demographic issues, on, you name it, pollution. For instance, to build a new Cairo city, they have been destroying the very few forests they had there. And Sharm el-Sheikh was hosting COP27. So it's absolutely unbalanced, okay? But in that sense, imagine how still the journey has to go a long way in the south of the Mediterranean. We cannot generalize, as we say. One thing is Morocco, another thing would be Egypt, not to mention Libya, whatever, but there's a huge problem on the quality of institutions in a broad sense. And that also goes for what you were saying, doing what you haven't mentioned, but it's also very interesting, which is public science, which is another thing in which CREAF has experience in working, is utilizing in a good way citizens to bring insights from what is happening in society from a science perspective, but also lobbying, using them in a proper way to lobby with the left hand of things. So imagine also that in the South is quite missing, freedom of press, freedom of association of civil society, and so on. So it's tough, but it's extremely urgent, okay? Here you were saying before, Yeah, you were saying, if some of you saying that you have met with scientific backgrounds in the last 6 months. Some of you just raise your hand. Maybe now you're rethinking your answer. You know? Can you tell me in what framework? I mean, was it at a personal level? Was it at university? Was it in a project? Just 1 second. Yeah. In what context you met a scientific profile?
It's my friend. She studies in London, and she's doing natural sciences. Mm-hmm. And now she's doing doctorado, I don't know how it's said.
A PhD.
Mm-hmm. In astrophysics. Mm-hmm. So it was just a conversation in a bar. So
astrophysics and political science.
And you are interested in what exactly? So you're interested in international relations. So you like foreign policy. You like international governance. Are you interested in a particular topic?
Well, I'm more interested in communication inside organizations. So I would prefer to be in the back, just communicating the things that others decide.
Because, like astrophysics, it's a very important topic in foreign policy nowadays. So
I will enforce
here you have like a topic of conversation that you can share.
Okay. Thank you.
I want to ask you one thing. Is there any other question? Sorry, from the floor. Yeah, please. Just 1 second for the micro. Although we hear you, but it's recorded, so you better have the micro.
Hi, thanks a lot for the presentation. I'm Nila Anders. I'm actually not part of the master's program, but I also have a background in politics, international relations, and after my studies I also worked in international cooperation for about a year. And now I'm in Barcelona as a sustainability analyst, where basically we rate supply chains according to sustainability criteria, and I'm also helping to develop the methodology in terms of human rights, especially also gender, and conflict minerals. And I have 2 questions. One is related to COP15 and the agreement. I mean, I know that in terms of politics and geopolitics, it's quite forward-looking, or it's quite sensational that this agreement came about. But I wanted to know your opinion on the content of the agreement in terms of biodiversity, and so the very scientific perspective on that. And then my second question is probably related to the first question that was asked, and it's about what do you think of the term evidence-based policy, and how would you interpret it, and what would you make of it? Because I feel like that it's used a lot, and in many different contexts. And I also use it a lot if I want to make an argument. But I just wanted to know what your take on that. Thanks.
So I'm going to start answering the second question. I try to avoid to say evidence-based policies. And what I try to say instead is evidence-informed or science-informed policies. Because I do think that there is a difference here. I think that I mentioned a couple of times that science shouldn't be the only perspective informing policies. There are other topics to take into consideration, not only science. I mean, if science says that you need to, replant a forest here, but here there is a community of people living and you are going to force them to live in a different place. Well, but science is saying, yeah, but there's a community of people living there. So that's why science shouldn't be the only thing informing policies. And I also try to stay away of using based, because it's not based, it's basically inform. You should be informing. You shouldn't be basing everything on science. First of all, I mentioned at the beginning, when I put those 2 columns, the diplomacy and the science, I said that diplomacy is about stability, right? But science is about change. Because today we know some things, but maybe tomorrow we are going to, oh, sorry, we were wrong. that thing, that theory, or that science changes because we are making new discoveries constantly, and not everything changes, but it's evolving. It's a thing that is alive. Science. You need to be questioning everything. That's science, to question even the things that you think that are written with blood. You need to question them. So it's informing. It's informing to the people that have or should have the ability to make the best decisions. And you should be informing from different perspectives, not only science. That's why I don't use evidence-based. And your first question about COP15, my opinion, and I'm going to give my personal opinion, not my institutional opinion. So my personal opinion about COP15 and the agreement is that the agreement is far away from being perfect, very far away from being perfect from the scientific perspective. But walking out from Montreal without an agreement would have been a massive disaster. So, this is probably a common question for your students, like, what is better, a bad agreement or non-agreement at all? So that's the conundrum that we face in every negotiation, but especially in COP15. What was going to be better, a non-agreement or a bad agreement? I do think that in that case, I'm not going to say that it's a bad agreement, but I do think that in that case, walking out without an agreement would have been really, really bad. And at least now we have a guiding document to design policies and make some decisions. It needs some improvement, and you also need to understand that how the UN works is that the agreements are made by consensus. So that means that most of the decisions are always going to be, based on minimums. So, and that's the Paris Agreement. Everybody thinks about the Paris Agreement, and everybody says, you think about the Paris Agreement, it's like, oh my God, the Paris Agreements are fantastic. No, the Paris Agreement is not fantastic. So it is kind of the same situation. So it is really good that we have something. Let's think from the perspective that this is a working action. That's good. We learn our lesson from the Paris Agreement. I think that the 30 by 30 by 30, which if you don't know what it is protecting 30% of the ocean, 30% of the land by 2030. I think that that's very ambitious, but nowhere says how to do it. So, and the key component, which is unresolved, is who and how are we going to pay for all of this?
Hi, congratulations on the presentation. My name is Joris Andalinas. I serve as an adjunct professor in space law and drone law. One of my fields of expertise is aerospace law, and the Copernicus program is a satellite program that one of the missions is to capture and gather data from the marine environment, and once this data is captured, it's analyzed, and then you can obtain information such as biochemistry, temperature, current tides, and so on. Of course, there's a huge policy and law effort behind this program. My question, of course, one of the fields I study is the Marine Strategy Framework Directive that set out 2020 as a date, as a deadline where all the states of the European Union should have met a good environmental status of the waters, of the coastal waters, let's say. And also there was another directive called the Maritime Spatial Planning Directive that established 2021 as another deadline to meet the requirements of the directive. I explain all that because I would like to know your opinion. If you have any direct or indirect experience regarding the marine directives, and of course, to me, 2020 was a year that deadlines were not fully met. I don't know if you agree with me in this regard. And of course, a new framework and new legal tools have come out. So nowadays, where are we at the moment concerning the Marine Strategy Framework Directive, or where does the efforts of the EU are going? Thank you very much.
So, first of all, you should give also a talk, because I didn't talk about anything related with our special and like all of these things. I basically focus on environmental science diplomacy, because this is what I do and this is what CREAF does. But there's a whole of, like, there's a lot of other things related with science diplomacy that I'm not an expert in them, and they're incredibly interesting. We have a researcher in Copernicus, Joan Massó. I don't know if you know him. He is part of Copernicus as well. Yes, I agree with you. The targets were not met, the 2020 targets. A lot of it was the pandemic, but not all of it. I think that it was, some of the targets were very ambitious, and they were not able to fulfill them. And I do think that I think that the ocean or the marine area is always, I mean, SDG 14 is always the last one. Everybody forgets about SDG 14, everybody forgets about the ocean, everybody forgets about marine stuff. It's like the last thing that everybody thinks about it. So I don't really know the state nowadays from the European Union about these issues. I've been talking to some people at COP15 about all of this, and they were highly frustrated. And I can put you in touch with them if you want to. And other than that, I think that part of the, like, we need more legally binding instruments to be able to fulfill whatever new objectives we are going to have. And I think that we need some realistic objectives as well. But that's as far as I can answer.
We have, if you allow me just one.
Sure.
We have a major issue nowadays in the Pacific, for instance. There's it's called the Point Nemo. There's the farthest point on the marine region in the Pacific, where you have both coasts at 2,000 kilometers. Even the International Space Station is closer to Point Nemo than each of the coasts. And there's the spacecraft cemetery, where all satellites and former space stations are sunk. And there's a huge problem from an marine environmental perspective, all the radiations and so on. And
that
of
point
course,
is called Nemo?
Point Nemo, Point Nemo. Is so-called, I'll give you the reference afterwards. And there's a huge debate around that, because we have like 7,000 space debris orbiting and falling. We had the example of the Chinese module and so on. I mean, there's a lot to be said. So, but it's very important, to reach a balance on a worldwide basis, because we're so behind the scale regarding the particles per million, all that. So we're reaching like a point of no return. I hope not. Right.
That's really interesting, because this is not part of the high seas negotiations. So, like, I never heard that being mentioned in the high seas negotiations, and it's basically the high seas, so it should be part of it.
Yeah, I'm part of some working groups. I'm afraid Joan Massó is involved in one of the working groups of the group of Earth observations in Geneva. I'm also a co-chair in the Law and Policy subgroup. So there are major points nowadays that are not hidden but left aside, because there's no time. To deal with everything, and no budget, perhaps, as another reason. I don't know, I can judge it, but they're coming out. We are studying at, for instance, Embry-Riddle, the Aeronautical University in the US, we're studying like global major challenges. That's what caught my attention, the name.
If you allow me, what you're saying, it breaks me perfectly the ground for the question I wanted to. Is there any other question, doubt, anything else that you would like to add? No? So I will use your introduction, because you were talking about the need to have global cooperation, okay? But now we are having growing evidence that the world is being more fragmented, and is expected to be more fragmented in terms of zones of influence, okay? We are going to see how the Russia and Russian sphere's influence is going to be decoupled from all sorts of international organizations. We might see a growing decoupling of China, which is China, and its area of influence. So one of the threats that we have on the table right now is that there's going to be growing blocks in which they will share knowledge and science within those blocks, but they will very hardly share all that knowledge and advancement with other blocks. And we might even see, not a decoupling, but a certain growing distance between even Europe and the United States in certain issues. So, in the growing need of science diplomacy with global issues that you have been mentioned, that you have been tackling, but we might be seeing in the coming years a more fragmented and disengaged, decoupled different areas of influence, and that we can see it in the digital. Others are trying to build their own internet, Russia, China, to avoid international access and sharing. So how do you see in this growing fragmented wall of areas of influence? So these silos of knowledge, of science, that can have a deep impact on the coming years. How do you see it, Alice?
Yes and no, because I think that, as I said at the beginning, scientists, like I said that, I don't know how to say that in English, no somos seres de luz, right? So, but sometimes we are. So, and what I mean is that scientific collaboration and cooperation is going to exist no matter what. Nowadays, CERN is full of Russians. So CERN has still Russian scientists working there. There are still collaborations with Russian scientists going on, and this will continue happening. It is going to be more difficult? Yes. It is going to be more challenging? Yes. It is going to be dangerous sometimes, but it is not going to stop, because research and science is very much based on collaboration, and nowadays have a very big international component, and that's not going to change. It's just going to be more difficult. Unfortunately, what is going to change are the diplomatic frameworks and the international initiatives, the funding. All of these things are going to change. That's why it's going to be more difficult. But scientist to scientist, the first training that I got on science diplomacy, I remember they were saying to us that science is a neutral language. So you can, when you cannot talk about anything else, because think about Iran and the US. When they were not able to talk about anything else, they were able to talk about science. Or Russia and the US in the middle of the Cold War, there was this handshake in the space, in the International Space Station, between an astronaut from the US and an astronaut from Russia. And that's always an example in science diplomacy. So from the individual to the individual, when you talk about the science language, you are always going to find this common ground. Maybe not always, but it will remain there. And I think that that's what, now I'm getting into the philosophical phase of the conversation, but now this is what makes me, to have hope that we can always keep collaborating independently of you're from here, I'm from there. And what we need to try to build again is these diplomatic relationships with, it's a phase, hopefully, and they will happen again. But science is collaborative, and science is based on cooperation. Now we need to base science on solidarity as well.
Yes, one last word.
Sorry, one last word. I mean, look at the Arctic with all the ice melting and so on. They are talking about a figure called marine cadastre. They are parceling the Arctic. I mean, so many states that are interested, neighboring states. And also, look at the River Rhine. There are 8 states bordering the River Rhine. So, I mean, cooperation is, I wouldn't say compulsory, but it will happen sooner or later, I think. Thank you.
Okay, so we leave it here with light, hope, and open to see what's going to come in the coming, let's say, couple of years, because it might be really challenging years in many fronts. So, Alice, thank you very much again for your presentation and your words and your insights on this hot topic. Thank you very much. And see you next week.
Ja l'he fet directament pensant en compartir-la.
No hi ha res que diguis, hòstia, això no...
No, per això...